How's it going, y'all? Welcome to LUMIX Live this week. We are continuing our three kind of part series that obviously we started last week with kind of general basics about the LUMIX cameras. But this week we are going to be focusing on the photography-based options in the camera. So, things from time-lapse, high-resolution shot, live view composite to a point. Fortunately, I wasn't able to get a more visually striking demo than I've done in the, more close to what I've done in the past. But also like clarifying a lot of stuff about the burst modes, the various exposure tools, giving a clearer explanation. My voice is echoed. Point. Fortunately, I wasn't able to. It doesn't seem echoed on my side. Dynamics, maybe double check and see you don't have it open twice, the stream. What was I saying? Yes, maybe also kind of going over, clarification on like what the dual native ISO system is, how it works in the photography side. There's always a lot of talk about how dual native ISO works on the video side of our cameras. At least for the cameras that have the ability, which would be all the modern ones. And then even going into image formats, the functions and capabilities of crop zoom and hybrid zoom. So I've got a whole lot of stuff set up here to kind of walk through. Tons of demos here where I actually switched over. I'm using my S1R Mark II for this demonstration. And yeah, hopefully, like I said, moving in with this particular three-part series, wanting to give a little bit better prepared information ahead of time, so that we can like cut these up and, they're a lot easier to find if you're looking for a little like snippet of a certain thing that you're looking for to do with the cameras. So, before I dive into my list of topics, I want to remind those of you in the United States about LUMIX Pro services. We have the Red and the Platinum tier available. The Red tier is free, so if you've purchased a LUMIX camera, new from any of our authorized retailers, you can follow the QR code, use the link below, or the link that's on the screen right there, and you'll get yourself into where you can get yourself registered. Like I said, the Red tier is free. That gets you your 3-year extended manufacturer warranty. It gets you into the program, so if you have a need to send the camera in for any kind of service and support, you've got an ability to not have to go through the general service and support for Panasonic US. But if you're someone who prefers the higher levels of service and support, maybe you're harder on your equipment, maybe you're a working professional and you always like to have, kind of those checkpoints throughout the year, you can always take a look at the Platinum tier. That is our paid level service that gets you that 3-year extended manufacturer, just like the Red does. But on top of that, you get things like 20% off out of warranty repairs. So if it's a drop, a break, things like that, you've got, a better cost to repair things that wouldn't be covered under warranty. You get 2-day repairs with next day shipping both ways, so way less time out with the equipment. If for some reason it takes longer, if there's like a parts availability issue, if there's any kind of issue that's going to run longer than that, you have an opportunity for loaner equipment in the Platinum tier. And then you also get like your annual sensor cleanings, lens calibration, firmware updates, all the kind of maintenance stuff that sometimes we're comfortable doing on our own, but other times we'd rather have somebody else do it, because then you just know that it's done, it's managed by the people who built the camera. And then lastly, if you're someone who'd rather speak to someone for service and support instead of going through maybe a chat system or emails, you do have access to the membership hotline when you're in the Platinum series, which would be like Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern time, where you could actually call in and speak to somebody about an issue or a challenge you may be having. I also want to mention to everybody, check out the Discord. Link is down in the description. If you've never used Discord before, it's a really simple platform. It's old school text and image sharing. So we've got an entire setup on there for LUMIX troubleshooting, where myself and a number of others from the LUMIX team are there to kind of help troubleshoot issues you may be having. There's group chats for various different topics, different camera systems, suggestions. If you've got recommendations or things you want to see us do, you've got that over there as well. So, yeah, I think that basically covers all the kind of basic rundown stuff. If you have questions that you want me to address, and I'll address a couple of them at the beginning, then in the middle, and then at the end, we'll kind of wrap up with as many as I can get. Make sure to tag at LUMIX USA, as you see a bunch of people are doing. Just helps me see it so I can address those. If you don't tag at LUMIX USA, I'm probably not going to see it. So if you are asking a question and you notice that I'm not responding to it, it's probably because I didn't see the at LUMIX USA tag there with it. So let's take a look through the setups here. So a couple questions. Don't see a lot of talk about using Panasonic lenses on OM3. Looking at OM3, but have a G9 II and all of the weatherproof lenses. Yeah, I mean, you're typically, I don't really think you're going to see a ton of that kind of conversation. One of the, I'd say, double-edged swords of Micro Four Thirds. So the positive and the negative with the system is that, one, it is the oldest mirrorless system, modern mirrorless system, under the modern terminology we use for mirrorless, in existence, which means it's got the longest time out there. It's got the longest history. It's got arguably the widest breadth of compatibility and options across the board between a number of different manufacturers. So when things get to a very, I'd say, evolved position that Micro Four Thirds is in, a lot of times conversations tend to be a lot more on the, well, people kind of know those things, right? Or like the assumption is usually there. Fact of the matter is, Micro Four Thirds mount, it's a mount standardization that a number of manufacturers, obviously Panasonic, LUMIX, and Olympus, and a couple other companies are building and developing equipment for it. Any manufacturer is always going to be able to validate or state their weather resistance within their own products. And that's because of various different things, of tolerances, of designs for the lenses, standards that companies use for different validations. Offhand, haven't heard of any issues other than like very old Micro Four Thirds lenses going between brands with them. And that was more down to like color profiles or lens correction profiles that over the years have seemed to have been corrected. Just in metadata and how the cameras handle when they're communicating with a lens. But honestly, you should be fine with the Micro Four Thirds lenses if you've got LUMIX lenses and running them on another Micro Four Thirds camera, and vice versa. So you really shouldn't have any kind of issue, at least as far as I'm aware. So, is there any way to add on the Is there any way to add on the future the ability to take lower resolution RAW photos for the S1 lineup? I have asked about this before, and I don't know. I mean, is there possibilities? Yeah, there's always possibilities for stuff being added, especially with stuff like reduced file sizes and things like that. I think it more comes down to general design goal and what the modern kind of not status quo, what the kind of modern capabilities are as far as editing goes. In the past, a lot of it was, and it's probably relatively similar, that higher resolution cameras, so, the S1R2, old school thinking was typically, if I'm a wedding or a high volume photographer, I'm not going to want to shoot 47 megapixel photos across the board for everything. I want the ability to reduce resolution, and to some extent there, is definitely a valid point for that. But at least from the conversations and the the overwhelming response is typically higher resolution is desired. It kind of almost doesn't really depend on what kind of photography is being done. And that's just kind of where the systems are. That being said, reduced raw resolution is something that I know I have asked engineering teams about. I know we've been asked about that kind of thing before. And it is something that we'll continue to ask for with the engineering team. If it's something that would be possible, is it something practical? Does the image quality hold up to what we would, kind of hold our standards to? So I can't say yes or no that something like that would come or won't come to the cameras. But what I can say is, ask us, make sure you put those kind of comments, either if you're over on the Discord, put it in the suggestions channel, put it in the comments after these videos, so that when we're having these conversations with our engineering team, we can reference and say, hey, these are the people that are asking for this. And it just makes those kinds of conversations happen a little bit easier. So that it's not just a like, hey, I would love to see X, Y, and Z from me personally. That it really is something coming from all of you, those that actually use the cameras. Over the moon, the S1R2, seriously underrated camera. I love the S1R2. It is one of my favorite cameras that we've come out with. All right, let's do maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and then we'll move into the demos. This one says, please do not scale back the options or features in our cameras, ignore the whining of the newcomer, now realizing how much their previous brands did not offer them. Huh? I don't know if I'm following. The only time features or an option are either removed or scaled away are pretty much like I would say there's 2 main criteria for why an existing feature might be removed or scaled out, or altered. And I think a really, really good example of this is the 4K photo and the post-focus functionality. 4K photo, 6K photo were a way that we were able to increase the stills capture rates. So to get into those 30 frames per second and then later on into 60 frames per second, when sensor readout and maybe processing power for stills, traditional stills capture, wasn't really there in certain products. It addressed a need, and it was something that fit what was being requested at the time. When we moved into the newer engines, so the L² engine, we moved up into that series, and then the new engine that we used in the GH6, GH7 series cameras, and the G9 Mark II, we no longer needed to do the high burst rate as a video function. We were able to process all of it just directly at the high frame rate, and be able to encode RAW and JPEG images from it. So that kind of thing, as technology advances, as we find better ways to do things, certain features, quote unquote, would become kind of redundant. And when you look at what's available to do with maybe the space that coding takes or the resources that particular function would require to have ready to go, it makes more sense to remove it because you've got a better, more polished, or a more practical version of that kind of thing available. Same with the post-focus functionality. We find, as we evolve the cameras, you also start to find from users like, hey, it's a cool feature, but no one's using it. There could be cooler things we could put in its place. So certain features will get, kind of changed and moved around, or in some cases just removed because it's not something that people are looking for. And instead we get a list of items that people would really rather have. And yeah, we can do that, but we may have to take one or 2 other things away. And that takes a lot of conversation. It takes a very, very long time to make a decision to say, hey, we're going to take, this feature away so that we can add X, Y, and Z, because the overwhelming majority are asking for this, and next to nobody is asking or utilizing this particular feature. It's not a decision that's ever made lightly. for that kind of stuff. So it's not really something I'd say that we're in the habit of, which is like scaling back features or limiting features between models. I mean, hell, look, our S9 has what, 90% of what an S5II, S5IIX can do. It's just that it's more thermally limited in many cases, and it doesn't maybe have all the ports that it has because it's just not physically feasible to put them in there. So yeah, feature-wise, we're going to always put as many features as we can that are relevant to current day market, and then just kind of keep going from there with them. Let's see here. I know this is a... we'll be using newer LUMIX lenses for sure. Yeah. Animo says they need access to shutter speed to enable it on camera control of the Ninja, hoping you can put this to the team. I mean, our control SDKs and stuff have all of that information available to whoever's utilizing it. So if they're in contact with our engineering team in Japan, then, which I'm sure they are, yeah, that would be there. A lot of times that kind of compatibility stuff, it's primarily handled over in Japan. It's not really something in the domestic regions that we handle. But I will say that our control protocol for controlling the cameras over USB is publicly available. So I know this is a wish list question. I do soccer photography. I wish LUMIX did an f2.8 400mm. It would be interesting. I can tell you, like, right now, our general product focus is definitely not really sports and like heavy sports and heavy wildlife. I know it's one of those points people are always like, why don't we make a top tier, quote unquote flagship camera for, competing against those class cameras? And well, because it's just not where our target is. We have capable cameras 100% in those categories. Same with lenses. If you need something similar to that, I highly recommend taking a look at the Sigma. What is it, a 500? It's not a 2.8, but the 500mm I know is a really solid lens, getting for range like that kind of stuff. And then last question I'll take now, and then we're going to jump into the kind of step-by-step stuff that I've got here was, what would best autofocus mode for fast action sports like football, human eye and body, or urban sports? So 00 Silver Wings. So for sports, things like football, basketball, baseball, soccer, realistically, you're going to be using the human body detection, because that's going to get you like all of it. And the logic with it is that football, baseball, soccer, hockey, things like that, the human form is typically in a pretty predictable position. What I mean by is it's relatively easy to identify the torso, the arms, the head, the legs, and they're in a relatively normal position. The urban sports mode, or detection mode here, think of this as more situations where the human body is likely going to be kind of more contorted. So if you were going to be photographing, say, we use like the examples like breakdancing, to some extent BMX, skateboarding to an extent. It'll always vary a little bit with those because they kind of walk a fine line. So yeah, gymnastics or breakdancing. The other big one would be something like gymnastics, where it's going to be a lot more kind of motion. So think like pommel horse, uneven bars, stuff like that. The human body tends to go into a form that doesn't... It may look like something else. It may look like a bird, that kind of thing. But like legs and arms and head position are not always where they would kind of expect to be. So for football, soccer, action sports, in general, I would say stick to human detection, because that's going to encompass the body, the head, the eyes, the face, all the different options there, and it's going to go between all of them depending on distance to subject and, what's visible. But more importantly, would be making sure that your custom AF settings are set to the correct mode, or the settings. Our cameras have, out of the box, if you've never played with AF custom setting modes, you're doing yourself a big disservice when it comes to things like sports, wildlife, photographing your kids or your kids' sports, anything along those lines, because out of the box it's tuned to be, I would say, kind of pretty conservative. It's not the fastest, it's not the slowest. It's designed to be much more smooth. In more hectic environments like sports and wildlife and stuff like that, you are probably wanting to prioritize, hey, just get to the point fast. Be there, be fast, be accurate. You're not as worried about, is it going to be, is there a perception of pulse or jittering? You've probably seen this in YouTube videos, even with the leading camera focusing systems that everyone claims. You watch some of those things and you see that system actually like jerking like this, all because of a subtle movement. That's a bit too twitchy. Our system is out of the box designed to be much more kind of smoothed out there. But with the adjustments, you can make it just as twitchy if you want, if that's something that you need. So, all right. Good on questions for the moment. Let's dive into some of the different capabilities with these cameras. To start with, let's jump over to my camera. So many people probably know, but also I think some others have no clue about this. But within the LUMIX cameras, you have a built-in intervalometer or time-lapse capability. The big thing with our cameras has always been, and this almost doesn't matter what camera you use from our system, we've got some sort of time-lapse functionality built in, is that this allows you to be able to go in. You don't need to buy any kind of real external accessory. You can jump right into being able to do time-lapse or stop-motion animation without any additional headache or cost into this. So within the setup, you'll notice that when you change into the mode to actually enable this, you're going to get a little pop-up there that's saying like start time, image count, shooting interval, whatever the date and time is right now or whatever the end time is. But then it goes away real quick. So let's actually talk about how you do this. Well, start with, you're just going to press the menu set button. When you change your mode dial into either high resolution shot, time-lapse animation, or time-lapse or stop-motion animation, it's going to default the menu to go into that particular page. So in this case, you'll see I now have the options for my time-lapse or my animations. All I do is when I click onto this is where I can set what it is I'm trying to do. So I mentioned that we have time-lapse, but for anyone that's ever wanted to do stop-motion animation, we have that built into the cameras as well. You just have to tell the system, hey, I want to do a time-lapse or I want to do stop-motion. Effectively, at its core, the technology is pretty much the same. It's trigger a bunch of images, either automatically or through a remote or manually, and then be able to stitch them or provide them in a sequence for me afterwards. So we're going to talk about time-lapse first. So when you have it set with time-lapse shot on, you'll notice you get a couple of different settings here. You get shooting interval settings. You can do on or you can do off. Basically what this does is that you can set up a session for how many groups of, or how many images you want to take in a session. If this is on, you would have to manually press the shutter button again to start the next series of the time-lapse for it. Otherwise, you're going to have to, if you turn this off, it will just automatically go, it'll finish the first series of it, and then it'll just start a new series with this. Think of this as a way to say like, hey, I've got my time-lapse thing set up. Maybe it's going to be like a 12-hour time-lapse, and at the end of every hour, I want it to stop and start a new sequence of these so that maybe not the whole thing is changed. Or you can just set it, like if you want to set this into smaller intervals. Maybe you need the ability to say like, hey, I want to have, it's a 12-hour time lapse. It's all going to be the same, general exposure settings. Not really much is going to change. I'm letting certain things take control. But I want to be able to come in and stop it or have it say, hey, do smaller chunks of the overall piece so I don't have to work with just a huge number of a singular set of files. To me, this works really well if I'm trying to, like, in the end, I want to spot check certain things. So if I have this set to on and I have, instead of saying 12 hours for the actual time lapse itself, I set my parameters to 1 hour, and then it's whatever the images I need to capture in that hour for the output. And then at the end of each hour, I'm going to basically have a folder with the proper file naming for that set of images. I can then go to the next step, which I'll show you in the camera, is actually have the camera generate a preview for me. So you've got a couple different options here. You'll notice start time. As long as you have your camera's date and time set properly, you can utilize the start time functionality. After 2 seconds means you click the shutter, it's going to wait 2 seconds, and then it's going to start the time lapse. Or you can just come in and program an actual start time. So the actual setting of a future start time, like I said, it relies on a couple of things. One, it relies that you have your camera's internal clock set correctly. So, right now it's 1:26 on January 29th, 2026 in Central Time. I would need to make sure that on this previous page, right at the bottom there, clearly this is wrong. This says that it's 2:16 a.m. on December 23rd, 2025. So clearly this camera's got a problem with its time. I would want to make sure that that is set correctly to current day, current time. Go into here, and then when I hit start time select, I just say, hey, I want you to start the time-lapse sequence at this particular time. So that's the first part. The second part is power and how you're going to manage that, because a lot of people might be surprised. In fact, I know a lot of people are surprised that have tried this before, but if you set a start time, when you click the shutter to basically engage the system to say, hey, start the program that I've asked you to run, it's going to immediately put the camera to sleep. The reason for that is, well, you've told the camera you want it to do a time lapse later on. There's no need for the camera to be on the entire time. It just needs to wake up and start recording at the time that you tell it to start. So that's why the clock set is super important. The other thing is making sure that the battery system that you're using, whether you're using some sort of external power solution, like I love using these small rig V-mount batteries with the USB-C output, make sure you've got that set up. That allows you to be able to know that you've got power running to the camera. You can run it off mains power if you want as well, as long as you've got a power brick that supports 9 volt 3 amp out over USB-C. But at that point, the camera's going to go to sleep, and then when it needs to, it will wake up and it will start the triggering system for you for your time lapse. And then it'll go for however long you've programmed it. Which, speaking of programming, many of our cameras that have the time-lapse functionality, you'll be used to seeing this menu. You have your image count and then your shot interval. So image count is just how many pictures do you want it to take. Shooting interval, how much time between the images do you want it to wait to take the photo? Pretty self-explanatory. But if you don't know the typical calculations that you would likely want to go through to say, hey, I need a 30-second video and my event is going to be, say, 2 hours, how many images should I be taking to get a, kind of general rule for exposures? Well, if you press the display button, we have that kind of calculator built into here. So I can come in and I can say, hey, it's a 30 frames per second output, so 2997, 30 FPS, however you want to go. I know that I want my ending video to be 30 seconds, so that's what I'm going to get out of the camera. And then my time-lapse duration, how long is the event going to take? Well, let's say that the event's going to take 24 hours. So right now, this tells me, an image count of 900 images with an interval of 1 minute and 36 seconds is going to get me a 24-hour coverage that will result in a 30-second output when I bring it in, put it on a timeline for 30 frames per second. If I go in and say, well, maybe I actually want a 24 frames per second project, you'll see the number changes. It's actually less images. It's 720. If I come in and say, well, I actually want this as a minute, see, I get 1440. So this gives you the baseline. Anyone that's used to doing time-lapse photography, you may also look at this and go, well, but what about, if you want to do dragging shutter, or you don't want it to be so specific here. Well, this is where you have that ability to say, hey, I know that if my shooting interval says 1,440 images at a 1 minute shooting interval for a 1 minute long video is going to roughly give me the right number of images to output a 24 frames per second project, you can then start to play with those numbers and change them how you will. The idea here is that it's getting you a baseline to say, hey, I know, for this particular setup, I can hit display and say, all right, I just want this to enter in. It's good enough for what I'm doing for a project. Hit yes, automatically enters into it. Hit the menu set button again, and all of that stuff is ready to go set there. The next thing that we have in here is you'll see an exposure leveling option. So in our cameras, the exposure leveling option for time-lapse works specifically if you're in, say, aperture priority, at least as far as I have been experienced with it. What this allows us to do is, as things like ISO might be very variable, as your aperture might be variable, this allows the system to compensate for specifics where, due to modern lenses across all camera brands, if you've dug deep enough into metadata, you'll notice that there's a reported aperture, so say f5.6, but then when you actually go in and you look at it, its actual measurement might be 5.59 or 5.61. There's always going to be a minor fractional difference between it, which in the general world, you're not really ever going to see an issue there. And in video, you wouldn't see this issue because the aperture just closes to whatever you're setting it to and it just stays there. Because you have the act of the aperture having to open and close, it's not always going to, return to the exact millimeters that it has to for 5.56 as an aperture. f5.6 as an aperture. So exposure leveling helps mitigate some of that. And if you've got things like auto ISO where you set an upper and lower limit, this all helps just get a smoother transition through your images. And then last, on the newer cameras, you'll see create new folder at rec. This is an important one. This allows, if you've done a bunch of shooting, a bunch of photography and everything already, you've got create a new folder for the time-lapse, and then you also have the ability to come in and say, hey, start at a new file name so that when I bring it into my computer, if that's the path you take, you don't have to worry hey, what file number do I start at? Or I have to rename all of these files when I bring them into, say, Premiere or Resolve or whatever program you want to use for it. They'll already be starting at 0001 or whatever your file naming structure is for it. So that's all well and good, right? You set everything up, you hit the shutter button, starts taking your time lapse. But one of the cool things that our cameras do is actually when that time lapse is done. When that time lapse series is done, you're going to get a prompt on the back of the screen that says, hey, do you want to create a video from this? And I can recreate that. This was this morning. I set the tripod up out on my deck to do the sunrise this morning. And what you'll notice is that in this case, there are 900 images for this because it was over 2 hours and it was designed for a 30 frames per second output. What I can do after I've taken a group of images under time-lapse or stop-motion animation is I can go into the menu, I can go to the playback menu. And then if I scroll in, you're going to see time-lapse video. When I click on time-lapse video, it's going to look through the card. It's going to find any of those grouped images that we have. And in this case, it found the 900 shot one that I did this morning. I can hit set, and then I get a ton of different options. And now these options are going to change a little bit depending on your camera. This is an S1R Mark II. I actually have the ability to do an 8K 16:9 was it 300 megabit per second 10-bit output for this. So it'll take all of those images that I captured, it'll give me a 420 10-bit output in 8K at 300 megabit per second. So I can bring it into my video editing software and I can do some pretty solid work with it. Add on to the fact that I can also be shooting this in Vlog if you're thinking in that process, or if you're like me, I'm going to shoot it in a standard profile or Vivid or whatever normal profile I use for stills capture. But say I want to make this video out of it quick, right? Say I'm not super skilled at working with those time-lapse images on the computer. I just want the camera to do it because I want to be able to see it quickly, and that's fine for me. Well, I just select the one I want. I can change the frame rate that I want it to be outputting at. So by default, this is set for 30, but I could come in here and I can have this playback at 1, 7.5. So it gives you a bunch of different options for how fast or how you want the output to look in the end. And then you can also set it up for, do you want it to play forward or backwards? Once you have all that stuff set up, you'll see it's going to say, hey, this is going to take X number of minutes to generate. Do you want to proceed? And you would just be able to click yes. This is the part that you would get immediately after your time-lapse segment is captured. And then you would be able to enter that info and hit yes. If you didn't do that right away, that's where you go into the playback menu, time-lapse video, set up your settings, and then you're good to go. So what does that look like? What does the actual like in-camera stitch together look like? Well, I can show you. This is the raw, untouched, just shot from this morning, set with the time lapse. So I underexposed this by about, I think it was about a third of a stop, just to kind of try to not have the highlights blow out, stuff like that. Clearly, highlights are more blown than I would want them to be. The morning part of it, when the sun's not really up, it's not as deep blue as I would want the sky to be. There's not as much color, but I'm able to see very quickly, did the frame move? Did the tripod get kicked? Did something happen in the particular frame that I'm going to have to be aware of? And something you'll notice is that because I shot this in the full resolution, so the 45 megapixels on the S1R Mark II, you'll see that it is a 3:2 aspect ratio housed in a 16:9 output. So cool. For a lot of people, this is probably going to be awesome, right? You've got a time lapse that you were able to do right in the camera. This is cool. Never done it before. You don't really need a lot of skill for it. You just got to kind of understand a little bit of the basics, and we've put a lot of those tools in the camera to kind of help you with the general calculations to get a solid time lapse. But there is a side piece of this, and that is because you're capturing raw images. In this case, I captured the actual raw images. I have way more flexibility. I don't have to settle with just what the camera created. So this is where, being able to come in and edit and alter and work with the images that you capture in RAW can give you that next level of flexibility for something like time-lapse. So I've got my Lightroom catalog right here. And you'll see I've got, these are the time-lapse images. I've got 900 images in here. And I'm able to just make some minor adjustments. So I pulled the exposure down a little bit more, pulled the highlights down. I really didn't adjust much else other than changing white balance because I really wanted to get that kind of, the gold and the reds and stuff in the sunrise. I can take all of those edits, I can bring them through all of the different images, and then all I have to do is export those out, put them out as, in a sequenced image, and I'm good to go. Cool thing is that you get a very different output from there. So as a reminder, this is the direct out of camera, no adjustments made. Camera was set in aperture priority so that I could just get a time lapse. I can get my images. I know I've got way more than enough flexibility with the raw file itself, considering the raw file is going to have way more ability to pull those highlights back, to bring in more detail. And there's also other software out there that allows you to do a lot more editing here and avoid any kind of flickering. Well, with just bringing my exposure down by half and pulling my highlights back, I'm able to get a much richer tonality out of it. Now, this is after about maybe 2 minutes of work, so you have to remember that just adjusting a couple of slides isn't going to get you a perfectly clean time lapse. Those that have been doing them for a while, you'll see in the sky, because of my editing, you get a little bit of flicker sometimes in the sky because you get slight, exposure balance changes between the highlights and the shadows, or between each of the images. But because I have those raw files, it means I have that much more control over the images that I would want to use in a particular time lapse. So it's one of the kind of more fun things to try. If you've never used time lapse before, if you're strictly photography and you're like, look, all I do is photography, and I don't really have time for video, or it's not something that's of interest to you, that's fine. Time lapses are a really fun, interesting way to capture and kind of show passing of time. But our cameras make it really, really easy, especially for photography focused users, to be able to, kind of dip our toes into a little bit. Sometimes you get those situations where it's like, hey, that sunrise is just beautiful, and you want to be able to just capture it, but sometimes a single image isn't always going to really kind of get the feeling across, maybe. So you get a much, much, I would argue, cooler look than just a singular image. Singular image has a ton of benefit, and it has a ton of power in its own. But sometimes being able to string those together, especially if it doesn't really take much work for you, can tell a whole different story. And so you guys can see it side by side. Here's the side by side of them together too. You notice I lifted the shadows. You're able to get better color and tonality, so you can see that color and tonality difference in the highlights between what I'm able to do with the raw and what the in-camera, what I would consider proof, is able to get me. I knew that, yep, we're good to go. I can bring these into software, do my edit, and then I can get, kind of the look that I would want out of the time lapse that I would want to create. So let's look at some other questions that came through. Where did the chat go? So we did autofocus modes. Okay, cool. Yep, we got those. It's here. Is it totally impossible to have an external drive connected to an S5 Mark II X and still have Bluetooth Wi-Fi available? Bluetooth Wi-Fi, yes, I believe. Like if you've got a gimbal attached, there's communication overlaps in some cases. Hybrid zoom, which you're going to cover, supported on non-LUMIX lenses? Yes, hybrid zoom and crop zoom are compatible on non-LUMIX lenses. As long as that lens is communicating the focal length in hybrid zoom, as long as that lens is communicating its position and focal length correctly as you zoom it, it'll work fine. Hybrid zoom requires the lens to tell the camera what focal length it's at any given time. My understanding is the L-mount Alliance, the L-mount communication standard, it's part of it. So everyone should have it. And lenses are already, for the most part, able to do this. It depends on more if they're able to do it on the fly. But I can't think of an official L-mount lens that I've heard doesn't work with hybrid zoom. So And if hybrid zoom doesn't work, you can always use crop zoom. You talked about lower resolution, but is there any way of compressing the raw files for better buffer clearance? Above my scale right now. I don't believe there's any discussion about changing compressions or anything like that, or what its impact could potentially be on buffer clearance, buffer clearing. With AI autofocus systems becoming important, might it be a good option to be able to load custom AI firmware onto the camera, which can, example, request the camera to focus on a specific area? Max, this is a fundamental misunderstanding, and coming from a marketing guy, fundamental misunderstanding and a bit of, well, it's just a misunderstanding of the term AI. Interchangeable lens cameras, the things that we all talk about and we use that are standalone products, do not have AI built into them. I'll say it again. They do not have an artificial intelligence built into them. None of them do. What the AI references, or it's being used as, is machine learning. Now, we've said this for very long in a lot of our cameras. We use machine learning when it's a model taken and then put onto hardware to be able to run and identify. That is why, especially like in our case, we've been able to add or change or tweak how things work. That's just how it is. Cameras don't have an ability to run or function an AI system on them, like on themselves. They're not connected into, a neural network. They're not. Cameras are not typically powerful enough to run their own. Like we think like of AI, like where it can on the fly figure something out, and it's got this, ability to reach out somewhere if it's something that it doesn't have local. That kind of stuff doesn't exist. So AI autofocus systems, yes, they're AI trained autofocus systems. I think that's probably a better way to put it. So the idea of, hey, being able to like load something in there that it can then learn from, well, that's what engineering teams do. That's what firmware updates for your cameras do. Better detection algorithms, better definitions of models are updated, and then they're added with autofocus improvement updates, with feature additions, things like that. That's what a lot of times is done. So try to think of it more that way. That cameras don't themselves have AI in them. It's a grossly overused term. They're AI trained systems. You are using AI and machine learning models to have the system know this, basically giant lookup tables. This is, a human form. These are the different variants of a human form. Does the thing I'm looking at look like that? That's what all the camera brands are doing. So, let's see here. Cam says I must be in the bathroom. That's what all the cameras. Okay. Let's see here. Will multi-exposure be one of the features in a future update for the S9? That I'm not sure about. Not sure if the S9 has the overall hardware it would need to do multi-exposure. I can ask though. Yeah. All right, let's move on to high resolution shot. So we had somebody. Let me get this set up on my side here. I had somebody a little while ago that was asking, wanting to be able to print much larger photographs but not necessarily wanting to go ultra high resolution camera, or super dedicated option, because, it's only a part of the work that person particularly does. It's not the primary. That this person's primary was much more like street and, maybe some studio portraiture, stuff like that. It was much more casual. But every once in a while, you have a situation where it's like, hey, I need to be able to do an actual print, or the client that I want to work for, they need to actually print this content really, really big. And we're talking, 20 feet wide, that kind of thing. Now, we know that a lot of cameras, for the vast majority of what people are going to be capturing and how they're going to be delivering, 24 megapixels is more than enough. If we just look at resolution, not about intent for cropping or anything like that. If we just look at resolution, 24 megapixels objectively is more than enough for, I'd say, 90% of people's use cases. However, we don't live in a vacuum, and people love to be able to crop, and we want more detail, and you want the ability to, adjust and tweak and modify images and really kind of, make strong adjustments to the particular files. Well, this is where, as you understand your tools, you can understand where certain modes can give you benefits depending on what you're trying to shoot. So think I am an architectural photographer or real estate photography. Yes, exposure is a big piece that a lot of photographers ask us about the old school way of shooting, where it's, I need to bracket a whole bunch of images so I can get enough dynamic range to be able to output for, this particular client or this particular look. It's cool. It's definitely one way to do it. However, I would like to propose to many a different way to utilize your cameras, especially in certain cases like that with landscape, or not really landscape, with any kind of like macro work, real estate, landscape to a point, but also in situations where you need potentially better color accuracy or color depth, or tonality, whatever you want to call it. This is where our high resolution shot comes in. So we're going to jump back to the camera here, and I'm going to turn the dial on my S1R2 into the high resolution shot mode. Now, you'll be able to know it's in high resolution shot because you get a little icon on the screen right here. That's it's the two boxes. It's going to correspond to what you see on the dial or on the rear pad. This is a feature that the G series cameras have. So the GH7, the G9 Mark II, GH6 had this. The original G9 was the first one that released it within our series. And then all of our full frame cameras have high resolution shot, even the S9. Again, when I press the menu set button, if I wasn't messing around in these menus already, it's going to bring me right to the option for high resolution shot settings. And we're going to blow through these pretty quickly. So once I'm in high res, I have an option for handheld or an option for a tripod. Difference is here. Handheld, it's going to take 16 images because it has to cancel out hand movement. When it's off, it's going to take 8 images because it doesn't have to cancel out, hand movement or gyroscopic movement. So we're going to leave this off since I've got the camera on tripod. You'll see picture quality. You've got the ability to come in and do combined, which means if I have my camera naturally set to RAW plus JPEG, it's going to give me RAW plus JPEG. Or I can just singular to high resolution shot. I can say only record a RAW image or whatever. You'll also get picture size. You've got the full-blown resolution, which in this case is 176.5 megapixel or 88. You've just got choices for how big or how balanced for data size you want. So in this case, I'll leave it at 176.5. Simultaneously normal shot. This means that it's going to record the high resolution image plus a standard resolution. So I've got my high resolution 176 megapixel image, and I've got my 45 megapixel image. Good to go. You have your self shutter delay, so if you don't have a cable release or you're not using your phone for it, cool. You can just program in up to a 30-second delay. If really you need to make sure that the camera is stable and not moving, you've got an option for it. And then when you're not handheld, you have motion blur processing. You have mode 1 and mode 2. Mode 1, it's not going to try to correct anything that's movement in the frame. It's just going to leave it there. You could potentially get some artifacts. Mode 2, it's going to try to correct those artifacts or that motion that may happen. So someone walking through the frame, trees slightly moving, an airplane going through the sky. It can correct the vast majority of those things. So in this particular case, we're going to leave it on mode 1. That's all you have to set. And then just choose whether or not you want to be doing this handheld. So I've got the demonstration set up here of this currency. And a lot of times, you know, there are hidden things in this case, and I'm using a 100mm macro. There are hidden things that are, you know, clearly much easier to see under macro. So I have this set up to take an image. So we're going to take a single image. I've got a 2-second timer. I just pressed the shutter. It took those 8 images, and now it's stitching them together to create the high-resolution image that we can then take a look at. What's cool about this, like I said, is that it's recording both the high-resolution image and it's recording the standard resolution RAW file. So if we go into Lightroom here, you'll see here, I've got 2 images here. I've got my 176 megapixel image on the left, so it's 16,288 pixels by 10,848 versus 8144 by 5424. So 45 megapixels, 176 and a half. Now, at face value, I don't really see a ton different here, right? When you're looking at certain resolutions, what's the point? But I can come in, and if I bring this in and I zoom in to say 100%, so let's go into the edge right here where it says 50, and then you've got the little loop there. So this is on the 176 megapixel. This is the 45 megapixel. So if I zoom right into the same area, you'll see how different, hopefully this shows on YouTube, you can see how much more detail is actually being recorded on the high resolution image. And it's not just detail. It's not just sharpness and pure pixel density. It's that the colors are also going to respond better for editing. Being able to come through, and if I have to pull these shadows up, I have more data there. I have more information in the surrounding pixels, because now instead of a single, RGB, I think it's RGB scale, now I've got 8 images that have all been taken, shifted around together to give even pixels that may have been recorded as noise, now get recorded with actual color information, so real information into it. So when it comes to being able to say, hey, I want to come in and maybe I want to be able to get more information from here, I'm able to come in. Let's find the same spot that I was at, which I believe is right there. And I've got that much more detail and that much more information to work with. Let's see here. Real quick question from G says, do I need to download anything to process LUMIX RAW images in Lightroom? There are times when the photos look properly exposed in camera, but when I import RAW images, it's underexposed. No, there's nothing specific you need to download if you're using Lightroom. It's likely your color profile that you're shooting in. If you are shooting stills and you're shooting in Vlog, likely, because that's like 99% of the times, you are shooting in a color profile that is designed for video. So in stills, it's changing where the ISO point is. And when you bring that into Lightroom, Lightroom doesn't know what to do, or kind of knows what to do, if you are letting Adobe set its colors for your photo. So since we're talking about it here with this, let's go just to one of these two images. Let's go to the 45 megapixel image to demonstrate this. If I come in here and I look at the profiles, you'll see adaptive color, which is the new one. That's going to be just like Adobe's choice. See the massive exposure change? If I come in and I go to, say, let's do Adobe Raw. So there's Adobe color. But then if I close, and because I know I shot this in Vivid, if I just change this to camera standard, you'll see the big difference in how it's kind of rendering. You're also seeing some exposure differences there too. If I change into Cine V, you get an exposure difference. Cine D, you get an exposure difference. This is the common thing that, you know, kind of happens when people go to process some of these files, is you don't change this. You don't have it set what the camera was. If I had shot this in Vlog, I'd have an option for Vlog in here, but I don't think... Camera matching. Does it let me... Yes, it does. So, like, I can select Vlog in here, and it looks terrible for this, for the editing, but it's because it's not designed for it. So, what was I saying? Exposure controls, yes. So, high-resolution shot doesn't just get you more detail and resolution. Like, all right, cool, I've got, you know, decent... It's still solid resolution at 45 megapixels, but at 147 megapixels, it's infinitely more detail. It's way more control over the image itself. So if I have to, you know, really kind of push the image itself. So let's say I want to, you know, make some big adjustments here. Actually, let me do this the other way. So I want to like really bring up the shadow detail. Let's bring up the white so that it's not gonna, it's just before clipping. Bring the blacks up a little bit. I get a lot more detail and more control over the actual like fine tunes in the colors. So like, all right, this is a good example. I can see a lot more control in here, and this is not how I would, you know, honestly edit this. So we're going to copy these edits. Let's bring it to the 45 megapixel one. Let's paste those edits in there. So you notice like how much more like kind of color speckling and, you know, kind of shifts in detail there are there versus if I go into the actual high resolution, which let's go back to library. Let's do comparison. Let's bring this back to a point where we can look. We need 100 there. We need 100 there. So you see, as I push it, especially in the shadow region, look at how much more detail is actually, that's under my camera, so you can't see what I'm pointing at. It'd help if I can stop clicking things I don't want to click. You can see how much more, you know, info you actually have, like especially in this region and this region right here. So if I'm going to be doing things like any kind of like architecture work, or if I'm doing stuff where not necessarily dynamic range is where my challenge is, but it's the amount of usable tonality that I have, I am likely to be shooting in high resolution shot, especially if it's a static subject. JTech, this is the S1R Mark II. So being able to utilize this and know that, hey, I've got a single camera. If I'm on an S1 Mark II, I go 24 megapixels for, say, like 90% of what it is that I'm out there, you know, capturing day to day. But my client, you know, needs really high resolution for their work, or I have an opportunity for architecture away from everything. I don't necessarily have to pick up another camera. Now, multiple cameras is nice, keeps me employed, but we know the practicalities. Sometimes I need higher resolution. I want to be able to say, hey, this one job, yeah, I can take it. I got enough resolution so that, you know, if the client needs to print big, if I need to crop heavy, and more importantly, if I'm doing architecture, say exteriors, I can shoot ultra high resolution with a wider angle lens than I normally would, and I can do my adjustments. I can do keystoning adjustments. I can, play with the different perspective controls that I may need. And a lot of times, you would end up either having to take multiple images, like we used to with like gigapixel kind of stuff, or you're stuck with like, well, I've got 60 megapixel and that's about it. So cool. Or like other systems, you have to use a high resolution mode and then bring it into software to merge all those images together. Our camera just does it for you. All those images are merged together. You get the benefit of higher resolution, and you get the benefit of better color resolution, I would say, so that all of that flexibility is available to you like immediately. Let's see, there were a couple questions that came through here. We did that one. Were you using the 100mm macro? Yeah, this is with the 100mm macro. Do you know if there will be an updated version for all the S Pro lenses? Even if I did know future plans, future product or software, I wouldn't be able to say anything to anybody. I like being employed, and anything that ever is going to come out or announced, you're always going to see an official platform. You'll never hear that kind of stuff until it is formally announced, if there are things coming. Will G9 work better than G9 Mark II for Deep Space Astro with tracker? Long 1 second plus exposures will be used for this application. DR boost won't work, right? Any reason to use the G9 Mark II over the G9 here? From the DR boost perspective, I mean, if you're doing longer than 1 second exposures, I mean, yeah, you're starting to diminish, to the point where DR boost kind of goes into a territory where it can't function because of the amount of time to process all that kind of stuff. But I would argue that the G9 sensor, the original, the 20 megapixel sensor that was in that, versus the 25 megapixel we use in the G9 Mark II, there's a lot more difference between them than just DR boost. There's also there's core, capability differences between the two sensors. Really, it's going to come down more to, is the 5 megapixel extra, beneficial for you? Will it produce or help you produce better images? As far as noise and dynamic range and functionality out of it, I don't think you're going to have a massive difference between the two for that particular application, unless you're going to go in and you're going to actually kind of alter the sensor. You're going to put, a different filter stack on it or modify it for that particular type of photography. So, someone above asked for multi-exposure on the S9, S5 Mark II series like it was on the S5 and S1 Mark II series. Maybe they can combine it with shear overlay as an option. Yeah, I know people are asking for it. I don't know if that's something that's doable on the S9. And then, is it possible to have bracketed high-resolution images taken, then produce an HDR? To my knowledge, no. And I don't think it's something that is going to be available on the cameras. High-resolution shot, because we produce the image, it's processed in camera, and then it's actually stored out as that high-resolution image. The more of those images you have to combine and produce, the more internal processing power you need, the more internal storage you need, because you have to be able to work on that file. And as it sits, these are massive files for, at least in the S1R2. So bracketing and merging as an HDR image internally, it's not really a feasible thing to do when you're doing all of this in the camera together. So let's see here. I might have been a little ambitious with the number of topics I wanted to cover today in the hour and a half that I have for today. So let's hammer through kind of the rest of these, or as many of these as we can, and then I'll come back with more questions, because wanted to talk about, let's shift into image formats. One of the things that we get questions about a lot is, the various different formats. And we've already had a couple questions in there with it. Let's say, in case you guys aren't aware, people, including me, find high-resolution modes being accessed via custom button much better than having to use the dial. We've heard, definitely heard some people ask about it that way, but if it's got a dial, that's kind of where it is. There's not really much to change that. So, okay, so we've been asked a lot about different, kind of file formats and how the camera handles them and what's available through. And Lightroom just crashed. Thank you, Adobe. It just crashed. Yeah, let's close that. Hopefully the stream's still going good. Okay. Hopefully I didn't just lose a bunch of stuff. Oh no. That's not great. Okay. So let's see if this wants to continue. For those wondering, I just lost 2 of my hard drives on my computer, and I'm not sure why. Okay. Well, that's a problem for later. So, image formats. In fact, actually, with that, image formats is going to be the last one we're going to talk about today. I will probably actually not wait 2 weeks and just continue this one next week. So, all right, image formats. Within our cameras, we have a bunch of different options available for you. So if you're in the photography world, you'll know a number of the different options, right? You've got RAW, JPEG, HEIF is a new one. You have different aspect ratios that you can capture. There's all these different kind of, variables and options available for people. Some cameras will say that they've got, TIFF or different variants. And ultimately, you really kind of have to just understand a couple core basic things about it. So within the LUMIX cameras, we have our rec file format when you're in the photo side. This is where I can select whether or not I want to do a JPEG, a RAW file, or a RAW plus JPEG. Pretty simple, straightforward. Underneath that, if you're on the newest cameras, on the S1 Mark II, the Mark IIe, or the S1R Mark II, you'll notice that we have a switch between JPEG and HEIF. HEIF is just a higher compression, but also higher quality still image format than a JPEG is. HEIF files give you the ability to do 10-bit color depth and as an outputted image. But more importantly, you can have it flag as HDR on compatible outputs. So if I were to take an HEIF image right out of the S1II series cameras that's in HDR, I can take it right onto my iPhone and I can load it right into something like Instagram or whatever platform you want, and it's actually going to trigger everything properly as HDR. So if you've ever flipped through an Instagram feed or a Threads feed, and all of a sudden, like, one image is super bright, that's what you're seeing. So you have that option in the S1 Mark II series. You'll also notice that under JPEG or HEIF picture quality, you've got a couple different options. You've got fine and standard. Typically, we're going to leave this on fine. And then if you select HEIF, this is where you're able to say, hey, I want an SDR image or I want a hybrid log gamma image. Now, our HLG or our HEIF files are encoded as HLG using BT2100. So it's a hybrid log gamma curve. This means if I'm running or you're looking at that image on a standard dynamic range display, it's going to look fine. If I look at it on a high dynamic range display, it's going to maximize out where those highlight points should be. So I have a couple different tools available to me here to, maximize what kind of image I want. So we're going to change this back to JPEG quickly. And then the last thing as far as our images go, and this is a bit of, some people were asking about, is it possible to do like a reduced resolution image in the cameras? And at the beginning I said, well, no, like not with the raw files, but there is a way to do it with JPEGs or HEIF files. So because you can see I have the camera set up as RAW and JPEG, or RAW and HEIF in some cases, I can go to picture size, and then I can change the resolution of the JPEG that is being captured. So in this case, we've got 44.5 megapixels, so it's 8144 by 5424. I can actually say, keep that as my RAW file, but as my JPEG, make it only 22.5 megapixel. Or make it 11.5 or 2.5 if I really only need 2.5 for it. This is one of those options where if you know that the JPEG output has a very specific place to go, or maybe you only use your JPEGs as a way to kind of just kind of proof the files that you want, and you're not really ever going to use them. This is a way that you could reduce file size. You could still have them at a reasonable resolution for various different applications. So if you got a client where you want to keep your raw files because you want to be able to either preserve them or do more heavy edits to it, but then at the same time you have a potential need to deliver something quick to a client where want to deliver proofs to them, you could easily come in and say, hey, at the end of the job or at the end of the day, you're going to get, 2.5 megapixel JPEG images that you can use as proof so that we can go through and they can do selects and what it is that they want out of it. And then your raw files are the main high end of it. Or if it's just for something for social delivery, you can easily just have it set where, you're only going to get the 2.5 megapixel images out of it or something smaller. So this is one way to get yourself a reduced resolution without having to worry about changing framing or aspect ratios or stuff like that. There was one question in here that I do just want to double check on. When the S1R2 launched, I seem to remember a big emphasis on using it with Capture One, seeing using Lightroom. Curious, are there any advantages to using Capture One for editing at this point? The reason I'm using Lightroom right now is honestly just it was the first one that I opened on the computer. I do use all of them. Capture One is still the primary for photo editing that I do, but when I need to do certain demonstrations like this, or I want to be able to provide at least a display that's probably more commonly viewed by many people, Lightroom is usually where I'm gonna do that in. Part of it's just years of more comfort with the program, but as far as like advantages with Capture One, I still think Capture One's actual processing is a little bit better than Lightroom. Lightroom has made some updates since the early launch of the S1R2. But I like Lightroom's cataloging better. Capture One, obviously we have tethering with Capture One on the S1II series. We don't have that with Lightroom. So there's pros and cons with each one of them. Lightroom tends to be where we get most of the questions. So Lightroom also is the one where you can actually use our base profiles for your photos, where Capture One, just the inherent differences in the way the systems work, Capture One puts everything into like its kind of singular color pipeline. So what else was I saying there? Yes, so before I lose that rest of that thought, you'll notice there's one other thing here, which is the aspect ratio. So we talk about, the file formats and being able to change picture sizes and the resolutions that you get out of it. But this also comes into play with the aspect ratios that you're going to kind of, capture in. Full frame cameras, we know, are by default, they're a 3:2 aspect ratio sensor. It's the same aspect ratio that a 35mm film or film still image was captured as. And that's just what the current standard is. So that's what we benchmark everything off of. Within the Lumix cameras, you'll notice that there's a bunch of different options available, and it depends on the system that you're in. If you're in the full frame line of cameras, you'll notice that you have the option to do a 4:3 aspect ratio, 3:2, so the standard 3:2, 16:9, so for just horizontal digital display, 1:1, so square. But then you'll also notice that we have 65:24 and 2:1 aspect ratio. So 65:24, it's the very traditional double wide 35 millimeter effective field of view. Traditionally, this was a film photography capture format that literally captured, it opened up the gate so that you had two 35 millimeter images side by side, and that's how you got your image. Modern now, with higher resolution, we can just give you that aspect ratio. But then you've also got...
Someone's at the entryway doorbell.
Thank you, Google. But then you've also got 2:1. Now, one of the cool things is that if you're going to be posting something, say, on social media, say you want to post up an image for Instagram, you can do a 2:1 aspect ratio, like quote-unquote panoramic image, and it will perfectly load up onto, say, Instagram's feed and not crop off the sides. 65:24 will crop off the sides unless you scale it down to a maximum of a 2:1 aspect ratio. So where am I going with all this? Well, when you start looking at these different aspect ratios, within the Lumix cameras, our RAW files will always be recording a 3:2 aspect ratio in the full resolution. So that means if I've got my picture size, you'll see that I'm going to be capturing an 8144 by 5424 as far as my resolution goes. If I come in and I change my resolution here down to 16:9, you see if I come in, it's going to be doing an 8144 by 4584. So you get, it's, yes, you're losing the height, but this is only going to affect the JPEG image. My RAW file will always have the ability to go back in post and adjust my settings if I need to. Does the S1II series also lose phase detect AF when shooting other aspect ratios like the S5 does? The S5 Mark IIs don't. They don't lose any of those. The only aspect ratio that changes the focusing system is 65:24 and 2:1. When you go into these particular modes, you don't have continuous autofocus. You have to go to single focus. And that's because you're shifting so much of the, or you're cropping out so much of the visible area for it. But it doesn't change anything about the focus modes outside of those two. But as you can see, we call it out in the menu here. So 65:24 and 2:1 change to single AF. So, but yeah, it's a nice benefit to have, being able to come in and change these different options, because now I know I can use the different aspect ratios to capture and actually be able to I can actually just capture and use the screen, so shoot as is that I want to deliver, but always know that as long as I've got the RAW file, I can bring it in post. I can shift that framing up and down if I need. I can crop in more if I need. You're never going to be permanently locked into the particular look or the style. And if you're someone who edits with something like Lightroom, you're not even necessarily really locked into the color profile that you shot it at. You've got the ability to go in and say, hey, I want to have this emulate Lumix Vivid or Lumix Standard, or, you know, if you shot it in Vlog and you run into that situation where all of a sudden the image is looking 2 stops under, if you're in Adobe's Camera Raw or that workflow, you have that ability to go in and just say, hey, interpret this as vlog, it's going to flatten the image out, and you're going to have to do a lot of editing to get it back to its, kind of proper look and color and contrast. But that can help with that exposure difference that you see there. Yeah, I lost everything because that drive is disconnected. Great. That'll be fun to troubleshoot. So, well, with that, I am going to have to end the stream now then. I'm going to be back next week. I know normally we were going to do, basically every other week for this particular series. But the photo side had a lot more stuff to cover, and it took me a lot longer to get through them. So I'm going to continue the rest of this next Thursday, 2 p.m. With that, everybody, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Get out there, create some cool stuff. I'll add a link for the new stream for next week. It'll be the same time, same place. So LUMIX USA, 2 p.m. Eastern time. If I didn't get to a question or there's something very specific you want to talk about from the photography side of it, drop it in the comment section below. That'll help me be able to, put together or address very specific questions next week, because I do have a couple other things that I prepped for this, like the exposure tools, burst shootings, and crop zoom and hybrid zoom. But I want to make sure that I can get y'all the rest of that information and not have to deal with the fact that for whatever reason, one of my drives just completely shut off, and it's actually making me a bit nervous because there's a lot of stuff on that drive. Otherwise, thanks everybody. I'm not going to have an outro screen that I can show because it's not connected to the computer anymore. So we will just